As I mentioned at the outset, we have a team from San Francisco, and I have the good fortune of getting to work in some national historic preservation projects, and I can tell you from that vantage that we have brought with us some of the leading lights of historic preservation in the Bay Area, really the A-team. And so I think we're all lucky to have this group here. To my left is Tim Frye, and Tim is, now I don't have these titles exactly right, but the Historic Preservation Officer for the City of San Francisco. So does that make you the Shannon Miller of San Francisco? Okay. Does that help? Tim's with the City of San Francisco. To my far right, we have Donna Graves, and Donna is a public historian and independent consultant, and I think also the National Trust Advisor for the state of California. To my immediate right is Mike Buhler, and Mike is the maybe the Vince Michael of San Antonio. Is that okay? The Executive Director of San Francisco Architecture and Heritage, the citywide historic preservation organization for San Francisco. And San Francisco has been grappling with some of the very same questions that have brought you all here today. And we've asked this panel to talk to us about an example of how they've done that in their city. And so who will kick it off? Donna, thank you.
So we decided to do this in sort of a narrative format, and the reason I'm starting off this troika is that Japantown was the place where these discussions really became heated, and I worked on a neighborhood plan for Japantown that the city sponsored in 2007. This was the first time the city had decided to do a neighborhood plan where cultural heritage and history was the center of it, rather than that it was a specific geographic location where some development was going to happen. I was the historian on the team, selected to work with community advocates and city staff. Can you move to the next slide? Next slide. Thank you. Oh, sorry. San Francisco's decision to foreground cultural heritage in Japantown was inspired by a controversial proposal for large development, but also years of organizing by Japanese American leaders throughout California who'd been engaged in trying to preserve the last 3 remaining Japantowns in the United States. You see just images of those here. Those last 3 Japantowns are in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Jose. These were the last of what had been dozens of communities built in the late 19th and early 20th century that had any portions that were vitally intact. And community leaders had been arguing for quite a while that planning for preservation of these places was critically important. And they'd actually been successful in steering legislation through the state capitol in 2000 to support that effort. So this is just a visual to show you how many Japantowns there were in California just before World War II. And the date on that map is actually significant because the government was monitoring where Japanese Americans or people of Japanese immigrants and their descendants, or Nikkei, lived. And as I'm sure most of you know, World War II wreaked havoc on these communities when FDR signed Executive Order 9077, which called for forced removal and incarceration in concentration camps in the inland parts of the United States. It upended 120,000 lives. Over 3/4 of those were in California. Japantown wasn't just shaped by World War II. There had been pre-war discriminatory laws that prevented Japanese immigrants from owning property. And then once the community came back to Japantown in San Francisco, the fact that they hadn't owned property and then had to work so hard to rebuild their lives came under assault again when it was the first area targeted for urban renewal. So these repeated assaults meant that by the end of the 20th century, Japantown was no longer a residential enclave of Japanese Americans, but it still held community anchors, longtime institutions, churches, businesses, and organizations that meant that Japantown was really the heart of the Northern California diaspora for Japanese Americans. When I began working on the planning effort in San Francisco, Japantown, I was already partnering with those community leaders I had mentioned as director of this effort, Preserving California's Japantowns, the first statewide project to identify, research, and document, that says 48, but we ended up doing 50 communities throughout California whose public memory had pretty much been erased. Many of the buildings were still there, but the communities that live there now didn't know that there had been this thriving immigrant community. So we're working on what was called a Better Neighborhood Plan for Japantown. And after working with the community and doing research, city staff and I were initially frustrated because community advocates rejected the preservation tools that we had to offer back in 2007, and you see them here. You know, it can be a local landmark, maybe be on the California, the National Register, maybe create a historic district. I was advocating for a National Heritage Corridor or National Heritage Area, but the Park Service at that point wasn't moving forward with those. So really what we had was designation as a tool to offer, and community advocates weren't having any of it. They didn't want to landmark buildings. They didn't have much trust in government intentions, which I'm sure you can understand why. So these benefits we were presenting were not very convincing. Ultimately, we offered a couple things. We mapped community heritage features, which included both historic and contemporary cultural sites. But what people really wanted were tools to keep their community institutions alive, and I'm showing you just one. Benkyo-do, which was a business that still makes and sells traditional Japanese confectionery, owned by the same building for over a century. The closest we got in that earlier phase of neighborhood work in San Francisco was coming up with this term, a social heritage site, and developing a record form for inventorying social heritage sites. That discussion, though, led to, as the development pressures on San Francisco moved into so many neighborhoods, and so many San Franciscans were saying, we need to protect who we are, not just these buildings, it led to really substantive discussions and tools that now Mike and Tim will describe for you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll wait for... And I should note, while waiting for my presentation to come up, San Francisco Heritage, which is the citywide advocacy and education nonprofit organization, we participated at the tail end of the Japantown process. And some of the ideas that I'm going to present here were directly inspired by the social heritage inventory form that Donna had on her last slide, as well as the public process, the community engagement process that lasted, I think, over a decade in Japantown to develop their final plan. I guess I'll just continue talking while I'm waiting for my presentation to come up. So just to give you an idea of the context of what was going on in San Francisco before, just a second, that's Tim's presentation. I think you should have mine. Just to kind of set the backdrop. As many of you know, San Francisco is an extraordinarily an expensive place to live, expensive place to own a business, and has been made even more expensive in the past decade, especially with a huge influx of tech companies, in part because the city actually adopted tax incentives to attract tech companies like Twitter to move into the city and transform some of its more blighted neighborhoods, has resulted in kind of hyper-gentrification. That's an oversimplified explanation for the challenges some of these legacy businesses face, but I would say that was the kind of the catalyst for some of the challenges that led the city to take action to recognize legacy businesses and nonprofits and find new ways to assist them. Just to give you one of dozens of examples of businesses impacted and displaced in recent years. This is a headline from a couple of years ago. The Shreve Company, a very historic jeweler that was located in the over-century-old Shreve building in Union Square area of San Francisco, was somebody purchased their building and they were evicted from their namesake building. So examples go on and on. Here's a few other examples of bars that have been displaced or converted into new uses. On the left there, Esta Noche, an LGBTQ bar in the Mission District. And you can see kind of before and after what it looks like today. It is still a bar serving a different clientele, arguably much less character. And then on the right, really the catalyst for San Francisco Heritage's efforts to do research and look at what other examples are out there internationally and strategies used to protect intangible heritage resources. The business on the right is the Gold Dust Lounge, which is a famous bar that was located in the Union Square of San Francisco. It was proposed for closure and conversion into a clothing store, a chain clothing store. You can see what it looks like today from the same vantage point. And at that time, this was a very high-profile issue in San Francisco. There was a large constituency of patrons and famous people who had frequented the Gold Dust Lounge, rising up, trying to find ways to stop this from occurring. They, at the time, introduced a landmark nomination in an effort to try to forestall its eviction. And we, as a preservation organization, recognized immediately that landmark designation would not be the solution to try to save this business. All it would do, in fact, is save the physical features of the business. It could be turned into a clothing store so long as some of the significant historic features were retained. And ultimately, actually, on the exterior of the building, the historic features were retained. So we at our board level had discussions about what can we do to respond to this increasing threat to our legacy businesses in San Francisco. You're reading about them every day, and we as a preservation organization felt like we needed to have something to say when these culturally significant establishments were being displaced. So we kind of cooked up on our own a very kind of modest initiative, a public awareness campaign, I'll just call it, called Legacy Bars and Restaurants. And it was purely a public engagement campaign, and we launched that in early 2013 by announcing our initial round of 25 bars and restaurants that we were anointing to be significant bars and restaurants in San Francisco. And it was, we did a big press outreach and got headlines like this, and I love this quote from Carl Nolte. He's a real longtime venerable columnist in the Chronicle, saying, you know you're not in Kansas anymore when the guardian of your city's heritage asked citizens to help drop a list of bars, dives, and haunts. We were reaching a totally different audience, and the fact that we even deigned to list 25 immediately elicited comments from the public saying, this bar is not on the list, this restaurant's not on the list, why isn't this included? So we ended up announcing 4 rounds of 25 over about a year and a half period till we got to 100. We had, I should have mentioned, we developed our own criteria to be eligible for our list. The businesses needed to be 40 years old or older, demonstrate significance in their community, and have significant physical and intangible features, roughly. That was our criteria. And some of the outreach components, the collateral that we developed over that time is we developed a hard copy pocket guide to our first list of 100 with beautiful photos, a window decal program. Several businesses on our list displayed their legacy bars and proudly displayed their window decal. And then something that was actually very successful, we published a book in partnership with Heyday Books called High Spirits, and it profiled 26 legacy bars on our list. J.K. Deneen was the author. He's a columnist, a reporter for the Chronicle, and it just went into its second printing. It's been very popular, and I'd encourage you to look it up on Amazon if you're interested in that. So those are that was kind of the sum total of this initiative in our first kind of nascent efforts to recognize intangible heritage. In conjunction with the Legacy Bars and Restaurants program, we also undertook a more in-depth policy study called Sustaining San Francisco's Living History. And this was done by myself and our staff in collaboration with Tim and Donna contributed to this report, as well as and Vince as well, national leaders on intangible heritage. And what that report sought to do, well, first of all, we convened a community summit where we heard from members of various communities throughout San Francisco to better understand what the local issues are related to intangible heritage and the challenges these different communities face. And they were varied and differed from neighborhood to neighborhood, including representatives from Japantown. We surveyed 16 different case studies, both locally, and I should note that the planning department in San Francisco has been very innovative in terms of developing criteria for cultural districts and social heritage districts. So some of the examples we profile are San Francisco-based, but also internationally. And tried to draw from those studies recommendations that we thought were viable for San Francisco and could help address some of the challenges that we were currently facing. These are examples of just a few of the case studies of different programs that were evaluated and presented in the Sustaining San Francisco's Living History report. On the left there is a pub that was purchased by the community in London under their program called the Assets of Community Value program, where a community can nominate sites of important social significance and actually forestall development to allow time for the community to put together proposals to purchase the business and operate it as a co-op. So that was the very first pub to be operated under that program. Secondly, in the middle column there is the Bares Notables program in Buenos Aires, which was the direct inspiration for our Legacy Bars and Restaurants program. That is a city-run program where they have a plaque program, logo, they do marketing. It includes bars, restaurants, cafes, billiard halls, etc. And that was a really important example for Heritage's program. And then lastly, on the right is a bookstore in Paris, and the equivalent of the planning department in Paris actually has a very progressive program where they actually purchase real estate and put deed restrictions on how it can be leased. They have favored businesses that are authentic Parisian businesses that they want to promote, such as bookstores, cafes, in an effort to avoid having every store on the block be a tourist shop. Okay, so with that backdrop in mind, one of the key recommendations of the Sustaining San Francisco's Living History report, and we had a list of several policy recommendations, was for the city of San Francisco to create a separate type of designation for what we were calling cultural heritage assets. In other words, intangible resources that would include bars and restaurants and businesses and nonprofits, but also things like festivals and other intangible assets. What that kind of evolved into was a proposal by then Supervisor David Campos, who is pictured here, to create an official legacy business registry in San Francisco. And it was a little broader and a lower bar of entry than our own Legacy Bars and Restaurants program. The criteria allowed businesses that were 30 years old or older to qualify. And similar to our criteria, had to demonstrate that it had contributed to the history or identity of the community, and the owner of the business had to commit to maintain the important physical and intangible features of that business. And that was approved unanimously by our Board of Supervisors in April 2015. Just to give you an example of how the Legacy Business Registry has been applied to businesses that are listed on it. This is a nomination for Sam's Grill, a very historic restaurant in San Francisco, I think opened in 1867. My organization nominated this business. And as part of our process, the nominations are reviewed by our Historic Preservation Commission, who issues an advisory opinion, and then our Small Business Commission ultimately adopts it. But in terms of the types of features that the owner of the business voluntarily agreed to maintain include the physical features, which include things like those really neat private booths that you can dine in. But in terms of the intangible characteristics that they'll maintain, includes the tuxedo attire of the wait staff, for example, and staple and certain menu items like sand dabs. They're famous for their sand dabs. That was called out in our application. Now, I should note that for the first 6 months or so of the San Francisco Legacy Business Registry, not much happened after the program was approved by the Board of Supervisors. The program really wasn't set up to accept applications, and there wasn't a great deal of interest from the business community, I would say. That all changed with the passage of Prop J, which was passed by voters in November of 2015, and it provided funding for grants not only to businesses and nonprofits on the Legacy Business Registry, but also to their landlords if they lease their space as an incentive to get their landlords to agree to extend their lease into a lease of 10 years or more. So you can see the formula here. The businesses themselves are eligible for really pretty modest grants of annual grants of $500 per full-time employee with an annual cap, and then the landlord is eligible for a grant calculated based on its square footage of the space. That passed by 57%. We had no idea if it was going to pass. I was actually presenting on this topic at the National Trust Conference that year, and the night before my session, that was the election day, and we weren't sure if it was going to pass or fail. And it was a shoestring campaign, and but the pressures in San Francisco, the voters, I think, recognized the need to do something to try to stop the bleeding, if you will, and the displacement of these businesses and nonprofits. Now, just to wrap up, in terms of where are we now? So we're about a year and a half after the passage of Prop J, and there's some hiccups in getting the program all set up and ready to accept applications and grant applications. But now it's up and running. And just a few weeks ago, the San Francisco Business Times ran a cover story on the Legacy Business Program and kind of assessed how it's working to date. And this is just an image of it, but I just drew from that article some which I thought was some really valuable information that provides perspective on how the program is doing. Nobody claims that this is a perfect program. It is still kind of a work in progress. I think Tim and Donna would agree. But I think it's working relatively well, and certainly it is very popular. Over 75 businesses have been added to the registry to date. And these businesses are very proud of their stories and their role in the community. We were talking earlier in the table sessions about how it's difficult to get people to come forward and tell elected officials, the powers that be, about their histories. And this program, with its limited incentives, has really resulted in a huge amount of new information being added to what we know about the city's heritage and what is documented. And I think the planning department actually is using those nominations to inform the planning decisions in the planning process in San Francisco. The grants, the long-term leases that have resulted from the program encourage the tenants to make capital improvements to their spaces and enhance stability. I thought this was interesting. Of the 51 grants awarded to businesses to date, 22 have been used for capital improvements and 17 for rent. So it's not just one of the criticisms early on was that it's just to subsidize rent, but in fact many of these businesses are improving their spaces. And then you can see the average size of the annual grant. That was a major argument against Prop J, was the ultimate cost. And so far, the grants have been quite small, and I would say $8,000 per year. Most actually are much smaller than that. There's a few larger grants in there. So that's, I think, wraps it up. I'll transition to Tim, and he can tell us more about the future of what's happening regarding intangible heritage. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. Let's see if we can get this. It's just up there. Here we go. So I would like to share with you this afternoon some of our ideas about how to collect intangible cultural heritage data as part of a citywide survey effort. This is certainly a trial and error process for us, but I was sort of excited to hear some of the comments from this morning's roundtable discussions in that the idea of how we can collect this data was a reoccurring theme, at least in the two tables I was located at. And I will apologize, I finished this presentation late last night, and there is a typo in it, but please forgive me. But to start off, since the late 1960s, the San Francisco Planning Department has collected a variety of survey data, but primarily on an as-needed basis, most often part of larger planning efforts such as rezoning or area plan projects. And most of these surveys, I think like many American cities, were architectural surveys. However, over the last 15 to 20 years, as our programs become professionalized, we were using standard best practices in terms of analyzing properties for significance under the standard criteria and also integrity analysis. But while we've collected, I would say, about a third of the city's data, we've only scratched the surface when it comes to cultural and social heritage expressed through the many communities in San Francisco. And given the growing interest in the topic locally, we knew as we approached a citywide survey effort over the next several years, not only were we interested in this information, we knew the community was going to ask. We knew that they were going to want to participate in some way in the data collection effort, and certainly whether it was a crowdsourcing piece or some other piece of data, method of data collection, intangible heritage was going to be one of the primary issues that they would bring up. So over the summer, we had a National Park Service Underrepresented Communities grant, and we hired an intern for the summer who was fantastic. Her name was Ariande Bracanto, and we basically put her in a room and asked her to just think about this question. It's not something that there's a lot of documentation or literature out in the world. There are other disciplines that have approached the topic, but nothing closely related to the preservation field. So we just asked her, how can intangible heritage data be collected? And then most importantly to us is, can we spatialize intangible heritage data? She spent, like I said, the summer looking at a variety of different tools across different disciplines. She produced a wonderful paper that I'm happy to share with anybody. If you're interested, please give me her card, because she did raise, I would say, a lot more questions than answers for us, but I think we're going in the right direction based on, one, some very abstract concepts in our mind, but two is some pretty innovative projects that are happening throughout the country that we can apply to a historic preservation survey that I think are very applicable. So I wanted to emphasize the importance for us to explore this issue of spatializing intangible data, because we really feel that if we want cultural heritage to become an integrated part of our practice, we really need to make it as accessible as possible to professionals, and not just us in the room, but the folks we work with, whether they're at, Public Works or Recreation and Parks or another division of the city. If they have this data at their fingertips, they're more likely to respond in a positive manner to the community, and also know that there may be an issue the community cares about that they should interact with them, regarding before initiating a project. So again, I'm going to share some of the concepts that Ariande explored, but also some ideas of how we think we can develop a methodology based on those concepts. And so we came up with sort of three universal truths from her report. And one is that data are people. It's a reminder to us all that we often collect data without the input of the community. We're a body of experts. We share the results with the community through a public outreach process, but we often leave the data collection to ourselves or consultants. And we all know that cultural heritage has to be defined by the community. They're the ones that are experiencing the information that we seek, and we also know that in valuing these underrepresented narratives and addressing these inequities, we're building relationships through this process that are only going to help us in the long run. When we rely on the community as experts of their own experiences, I think they're more willing to trust us when we come to them with decisions about how we think, the city needs to maneuver through their community. The second is culture is fluid, so the data must be fluid. And this is probably one of the most challenging aspects of the data collection effort is, we need to, I think we all look at surveys, at least at this point, as a snapshot in time. Because culture is not a fixed concept, we need to build a database that's fluid, that can be updated on a regular basis, but also acknowledge that it will always be changing, and we may not fully understand the cultural heritage, but we should rely on the community to police their own process and respect sort of their notions of how their own values and experiences change and affect their culture. Naturally, like I said, this proposes a lot of challenges to us when we're looking at a data set. And then the third is that data collection is preservation. We started looking at the notion of just the recognition alone and bringing some of this heritage to light and sharing it with decision makers, as sharing it even within the communities that may not have the capacity to share information widely with their neighbors or even with communities adjacent to them, that the recognition alone is a way for us to, one, address the fluidity issue, but two is to collect information about a community so we can understand what's important to them. So the best way to do this that we think is sort of looking at the data that we've already collected. Ariane brought up a great point in that we have collected a tremendous amount of data as a starting point through the narrative experiences and values documents that we've already prepared. Historic context statements, oral histories, cultural mapping exercises, historic landscape methodologies. They all have data in them, but we aren't asking the right questions. And so if we can build a data set to ask the right questions, and we can look at this as she calls metadata, which was new to me, but is a very common concept, meaning that the data's context, we can begin to draw relationships across all of that information. Again, just asking the right questions. And I know this sounds a bit abstract, but I'm going to show you a few examples of projects that are happening or recently occurred throughout the country where we think we can start to visualize what intangible heritage would look like. So the first is something that San Francisco did. Donna Graves and Shane Watson are the authors of one of our favorite historic context statements, which is our citywide LGBTQ historic context statement. This looks at all the entire city's significant resources and history related to the LGBTQ community. What we did was we extracted information from that context on all the addresses where there appeared to be even a slight association with the LGBTQ community. While it wasn't a survey, we were able to at least put those into our parcel information database so we could flag those and let folks know, hey, if there's a project coming in, we may need to look at this property with a different lens than just sort of the bricks and mortar. Does it meet the events, persons, architecture criteria that we normally approach a project with? So again, this is the first step in synthesizing data out of an existing data set and applying it to a decision-making process. Now, to take that a bit further, another idea comes from this project called Crossing Borders, Bridging Generations. It was produced by the Brooklyn Historical Society. It's an oral history project, and it explores the complex experiences of race, ethnicity, and identity. Now, this project used, after I believe about 100 oral histories, this project used an open source tool called the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, which is quite quite a mouthful, but it converts audio files into searchable data without needing a transcript. So we think it's possible our survey could include an ongoing oral history component or crowdsourced interviews that also include audio files spatially located on a map, and they can be indexed. So maybe not the entire history has a specific geographical point, but maybe a portion of that history does. We're at least able to tether that part of that oral history to that geographic point while still keeping the entire history intact within the data set. So again, these geographic attributes may be found within the indexed audio file, and they're easily searchable through the program that we're going to use that I'll mention in just a second. This was one of my favorites that we found, and it's a project I think that moves us further towards spatializing intangible resources. It was sponsored by a group in New York City called Perfect City, and the group facilitated an avoidance mapping workshop. It asked participants, rather than thinking abstractly about, tell us about your culture, tell us about your intangible heritage, and then spending, a half an hour explaining what tangible heritage is, they basically just asked folks, what are the places that you feel you belong? Where are the places you avoid? And where are the places you feel valued? And they were able to draw these and create a spatial representation of a very abstract and intangible thing, this notion of belonging and conflict. So based on this data, we think we can focus on areas of belonging and value for further study, assuming maybe we can take it to the next step and thinking, well, a certain community may practice their culture or express their culture in areas where they naturally feel belonging or feel valued. And those may be areas that we want to target for further study. Again, without doing an exhaustive survey or an exhaustive interview process, we can start to narrow down these geographies. So we think we can replicate this approach on a large scale in a relatively efficient way, and that's through another program we found called Field Papers. Excuse me. This is another open source tool, and it allows users to print out any section of a map that they would like, essentially like a Google map, but it's a specially formatted atlas, and so they can print this out, and we could either offer a link to users, or we could print them out at events and pass them out, and people could return them back to the department. They can draw all over the map, take notes on it, whatever you want, but once they take a picture of it, the tool automatically geolocates all of the data and sort of knits the maps back together. So what we think we can do is add all of these layers, this additional layer of senses of avoidance, belonging, and value to our standard historic resource data collection, and start to see relationships between the information that will give us a better sense of intangible cultural heritage within various communities. So again, producing this at a large scale, and the planners acting more as facilitators rather than experts of collecting and evaluating this information, we think would take us in the right direction. And then finally, sort of our bigger idea of where all of this data would live is we're going to we're exploring using Arches, which is the data collection platform created by the Getty Foundation. Los Angeles has used this for their citywide survey effort. There's a number of other countries that have used this data, even in areas of conflict, where they need to map resources at a fairly quick pace. One of the benefits of this platform is the related resources search function, which you can see on the top of this slide. Sort of has these spider graphs. The one on the left is just an example of an architect at the center, and then radiating off the center are a variety of different projects that he designed. Tied to that, or tethered to that, are then other resources that are connected, related to ownership or occupants of those properties. So we took this idea and we thought, well, if we don't tie it spatially, can we still create this sort of data set in Arches? So we used the example of San Francisco street fairs. We went ahead and we didn't plot them geographically, but we entered in a variety of street fairs which we know will generally happen in the same neighborhoods, but given permitting issues, changes in demographic changes in that community, what have you, even funding, those boundaries may change over time. So we don't want to tie those directly to several blocks or a specific neighborhood. So what we think we can do is to address the fluid nature of culture is create maybe a set of commonly common expressions of culture, and then provide access to the public to essentially tether their ideas and their history to these spider graphs. In doing that, like the audio files for the oral histories, we think eventually information will come out that will direct us towards certain geographic locations. If we really desire tying them to something at the ground level, we could always do it through that geographic sort of notation in the tethering of the spider graph. However, it's still able to sort of float spatially over the rest of the data as a layer, and then it can be modified over time without disrupting the other data. So that's sort of where we're going today. I always like to quote one of our commissioners. I think, I feel very lucky working in San Francisco. We have a very supportive commission and a set of decision makers. And anytime we come up with these ideas to explore intangible cultural heritage, he basically says, we won't do it until we do it. And so to me, I hear a sense of like, let's see if it works. If it doesn't work, we can try something else. And to hear that, especially from a government agency where we like to always be right and we always like to do things a certain way, that's a reassuring place to be. So that concludes my presentation. And certainly if you have any ideas or responses to any of these ideas that I've presented to you, I would love to hear them. So thank you.